I'm very pleased that we were able to arrange this wide-ranging conversation at SPIA. We will discuss multilateralism and its relevancy in addressing our ever-changing global challenges, the implementation of the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a roadmap for our prosperity and growth, as well as the challenging question of Afghanistan and the important role that the United States can play in this and other similar contexts. With that said, it is my great privilege and honor to introduce our speaker today, Her Excellency Amina Mohammed.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think we lost the place. Her Excellency Amina Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Her Excellency the DSG will be sharing her insights and vast experience with us as we discuss these important questions. DSG Mohammed has been serving in her role for the last 6 years. She also holds the position of Chair of the United Nations Sustainable Development Group. Prior to her current appointment, Ms. Mohammed served as the Minister for the Environment in her home country of Nigeria, where she steered efforts to protect the natural environment and conserve resources for sustainable development. Ms. Mohammed is currently serving her second tenure with the United Nations. In 2012, she was appointed as the Special Advisor to then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and on post-2015 development planning. In that role, she was instrumental in bringing about the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Before joining the United Nations, Ms. Mohammed worked with 3 successive administrations in Nigeria, serving as Special Advisor on the Millennium Development Goals, providing advice on a range of issues, including poverty reduction, public sector reform, and sustainable development. Ms. Mohammed has received several honorary doctorates and has previously lectured on international development at Columbia University. We're hoping she will also consider SPIA for future lectureships. She has also received numerous global awards and has served on various international advisory boards and panels. Please join me in welcoming Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed to the School of Public Policy and International Affairs.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
School of Public and International Affairs. Thank you. The DSG will join. So right now we're going to start a discussion session.
Okay.
And we have a few questions that we've prepared for you. And the goal is to sort of open it up during the session to the audience, especially our students who would like to chime in as well.
Yes.
So we know that a lot of your work has centered around multilateralism and the role of multilateralism. Can you please elaborate on what that actually means and why is this such a cornerstone of your agenda and your initiatives?
Wow, you missed the bit in that read up on me. 6 children and 4 grandchildren. That's the way really. That was a real achievement, given the work that we have to do as mums. So, thank you very much, everyone. It's great to be here. And as I was saying earlier, we are in the UN, but coming into places like this with young people, and I'm looking forward to hearing your reflections and some of your questions, because that then helps us to see how connected we are with really what people are thinking on the outside of the UN. And it brings me back to the UN, and you know, nations united is what we would like to think we are. And I often describe the UN as our global town hall for the global village. And it is there that we all come to try to discuss issues that are beyond any one nation or community. And some days we may find the answer and some days not. But I think sharing those challenges, looking for the solutions with more than one perspective to it, is really what works for multilateralism. And 75 years on, this year in fact is for the Human Rights Charter. This body put together is a reflection of us. And often people say the United Nations, and they're not looking at themselves, seeing them as very much a member of it. So many of these issues that we speak about today, the crises we go through, sometimes the science that gives us the vaccine for COVID. I mean, it's in that multilateral space that we were able to figure out the the system with which we wanted to deploy it. We weren't so lucky when we wanted to do it universally. The impact was universal, but we didn't get the response right. And so that's, for me, being able to come into that space, being able to see that with nations that have and those that don't have, the Charter, for instance, on human rights, we are today facing many drawbacks, many situations where there's a backslide on human rights. And so we're looking at it, what's happening to women's rights, what's happening to child rights, our political rights. Today, Sudan is in a tragic situation. And I'm saying, you know, when we created the UN, we forget that many of us were not independent. And so how much of it did we own? And so the fact that we can actually have that conversation today in a space that signed off on this so many years ago is also a testament to still the need for multilateralism, the space that we have to challenge ourselves to become what we are trying to be, which is a much more peaceful world, more prosperous world, more together. Of course, that's not quite the case today, but at least we can strive towards it.
And that's a commendable goal. And so can you say a little bit more about how this multilateralism works for skeptics in the audience who might say that the commitment to multilateralism is one thing, but once you get at the table or around the table, the inequities that we often talk about in our societies also exist at the table at the United Nations. How would you respond to that?
Absolutely. I mean, there are different organs to the UN, so I think from the outside in, it's difficult to understand. It's almost as though it's been designed to fail because it is so difficult. You have the Security Council, and today, I imagine many of you are wondering, what on earth are they doing? The center is not holding. How is it possible that next month, you're custodians of the Charter, and one of your members throws a spanner at the works, and that member that has, broken everything that we hold sacred to the Charter will actually preside over the Security Council next month. It doesn't add up. You can't make sense of it. You are wondering what on earth is going on. So some things seem completely dysfunctional, and for years we have tried the Security Council reform. I still think that space, when you go into the Security Council, there are many things that are working. We do dwell on what's not. And I think that we continue to have a space either with the 15, because I think the 10 members of that 15 are what keep the center still holding. In the meetings that happen outside the Security Council, of the Security Council, we still manage to find ways to Afghanistan, for instance. We come to speak about the renewal of the mission. Do we need a mission? And what value does it have? And that's debated, that's discussed very seriously, including with those in Afghanistan. And we come out with, yes, we will extend it, but what more will we do? We'll put up an assessment. And that all comes out of the Security Council. As complicated as things are, it continues to function. We need better representation. We know that it is not fit for purpose for today, and we continue to try to make that different. Why is it so hard? Well, the ownership of the UN. And so much power was put in those who are supposed to have a level of responsibility that perhaps today we would question. But not all is lost, because then we have the General Assembly. And in the General Assembly, where there is quite frankly, quite a lot of inequality, we all have equal voice, but we don't have equal muscle. Okay. So we can go there and we can voice ourselves, but we don't necessarily come to that table with the same strength in expertise, in political power, and that's difficult. But that then, you see the blocks working. You also see that maybe a small country like Liechtenstein will for years say that, the veto power of the Security Council cannot just be left to them. We need to have a discussion. And it means nothing for years. They, plug away at this. And then suddenly one day there is this war in Ukraine, and it opens up an opportunity, and everyone says, we will discuss the veto. And that resolution is born. And so today, any veto that you have in the Security Council will go to the General Assembly for discussion. That's really important because it's the first time it's not all shrouded. It comes out into the open and we debate it and we talk about it. Still, we can't, get to where we need to get to with the resolutions that we have in the General Assembly. But we have the ECOSOC, which is sort of our mothership for development. There is, of course, our Human Rights Council. So all the different parts come together somehow. And you watch countries evolve and gain better space and create blocks within the UN and move and try to close the gap between what is a reality and sometimes not very good for many, and then the aspirations. And every day you're plugging away at trying to close that gap. Sometimes it closes and sometimes it opens, but that's our life, I guess. That's the life of the UN, and it's the life of many of us in the world today. This is what we strive for. It's a very important body for the smallest of our family. When we were designing the Sustainable Development Goals, and we said we'd leave no one behind, and I thought, what does that really mean? So let me go to the smallest member of our family and see what that looks like on the ground. And that was Nauru, an island in the middle of nowhere. And to sit with them and to see what their aspirations were, and if they felt at all connected to what we said was this global town hall, or if they did feel so, where were we lacking? What were their aspirations for, being an integral part of our human family on a more equal basis?
Well, that's very well put. So you mentioned that there's the war in Ukraine, Russia with Ukraine. You mentioned that there are fears about democratic backsliding. In many ways, the political moment that we live in today is not what it was in 2015 when the goals were adopted. Would you say that the political climate across the world is impacting or affecting negatively the way or the implementation of the Millennium Goals?
I think so. I mean, it didn't happen. It started happening before Ukraine. So let me see now. In 2015, there was great hope. It took us 4 years to marshal out those 17 goals. And many said to us, why 17? We got from 8, and this is such an odd number. And, but that's what life is. It's odd, right? And that was a response that people wanted. And we could have done it in a nice, neat set of 10 or 12. But life's just not neat, and people were demanding more. And we had civil society, we had academia, we had everyone in the room expecting different things. And so what you see there is a response to the challenges that we have. And mostly people talked about the injustices, they talked about the inequality, they talked about the lack of access to so much that should, whether public goods or global public goods or otherwise. And since then, we were off track with the SDGs because the one thing that we did was to kick power in the shins and say this can't belong in one space. The first thing we needed to realize was that people who wanted development should not just have a piece of it. And the MDGs was a piece of it. It was the social pillar. And so all we were saying was, we've got to save women in childbirth and children before the age of 5. And you were thinking of doing that without a health system? So this was almost like a Band-Aid on the real issues that needed to be dealt with. And so therefore, for us, it was about saying sustainable development was coming of its age. We had started talking about that in the 90s in Rio. But to see a DNA that said the environment, the social aspect, and the economy come together, and that you join this up, and the outcomes would be in people's lives, and would be able to live on a planet that would survive us in our destructive nature. So a lot that came to fruition. And if any of you know the goals, the first 6 really speak to what are the basic rights, services that governments owe their people, from dealing with the issue of poverty and hunger to gender and education, health, and water and sanitation. But there's a middle piece there that is from 7 to 15. These are where we should be investing. Because if we invest in that, a nation grows more inclusively, delivers the revenues that pay for 1 to 6, and not this idea that ODA is going to pay for your health service. Because that's the narrative, is that we've got to have projects in health, and this is the way we're going to develop countries. So no, the paradigm shift was that let's actually live with countries' aspirations for their economies to grow, for nation building, for everyone to be more equal in those societies and rights to be upheld. And that's why our goals on 16 and 17 are really important to institutions like this and otherwise, and the partnerships that we need that you spoke about just earlier. But when we were tested with these goals, it was COVID. I mean, before COVID, yes, off track because we really were trying to get to grips that we had to do the whole of development and not a piece of it. COVID came along and it just stopped the world in its tracks and gave us an opportunity perhaps to reflect on the direction we were going, because clearly the science was telling us what we were doing was not tenable for the planet, but also the levels of poverty and inequality and injustices and the conflicts. You had to stop and think about this. Were we really attending to this in any way at all? And great things happened out of COVID in spite of the losses that we had of people, of livelihoods, because we came to see that it wasn't just a health pandemic, it was a socioeconomic catastrophe for many countries who were never ready for this. And I think that that's where things became harder, but there was science. We produced a vaccine. We got together as a world. In fact, in many countries, people came together, families came together. I mean, we sort of, this was what COVID did to us. But as we began to get what we required to deal with COVID, then the world and its fissures became much clearer. The inequalities, the inability for us to come together in the face of a tiny little virus that brought us to a standstill equally, in terms of it, you know, it doesn't matter which part of the world you were, you didn't stand a chance of surviving. And we didn't have the right response. We had the right response of the vaccine. We had the right response to even create the vehicle, but we just couldn't get it together to give it to everyone equally. We couldn't get it together to give the resources that were available in the socioeconomic impacts so that we could deal with social protection and people, women, children, didn't lose, many of them lost their lives, but their livelihoods. So that was one thing that I think has, you know, polarized the world, in that the trust deficit that we began to reap came from COVID. And it was not long after that, as we were trying to recover, that along comes the next crisis, amid, by the way, all the climate crisis that we've had, was the war in Ukraine. No one ever imagined that in 2022 that we would have a war in Europe. This was furthest, every war was in somewhere else. It was in the Arab region, it was in Africa. It's never to do with those that, you know, should know better. But we did. And the epicenter of that war, Ukraine, and rightly so, you know, you put your oxygen mask on first before you attend to others, was in Europe. But the aftershocks on the cost of living, on energy, on debt because of inflation in Europe, and therefore the interest rates of the debt that you never expected to pay at that, have put everyone else in crisis in the developing world. Was there a response? Is there a response? No. Perhaps the best that came out of it, again, because of the multilateral system, was the Black Sea Grain Initiative, where we tried to make sure grain from Ukraine, we suddenly realized everything was coming from Russia and Ukraine in terms of grain, could be dealt with, and we're still working at it, and maybe I cannot, you know, have the discussion on the challenges of that today. So, and both of these instances, they do knock you off course of the SDGs, because the SDGs are what you are looking for the resources. There's no fiscal space anymore. There's no liquidity. And you are grappling now with trying to see whether you pay for health or you pay for education. And yet in other places you can print money. You look for access. I mean, some developing countries have got incredibly good macroeconomic fundamentals, but they're not got access to the markets, and at rates that are affordable. So are we worse off since 2015? Yes, the geopolitical tensions have created an environment where it's very difficult for us to see that there is an equal world in access to the means of implementation for the SDGs. We can speak to climate and the responses we should have. one of the responses there is to say, well, we need to go green, and so let's look at the energy piece. We need investments in that. And that has a lot to do with supply chains, it has a lot to do with technology and finance. The war in Ukraine showed us the energy crisis, but it showed how very quickly we could provide resources for one part of the world and not another. Right. It showed very quickly when we spoke about getting behind the end of fossil fuels because of the damage they were doing to our planet. We were probably okay on coal, but then it came to gas. And suddenly gas was a transition fuel. It was a transition fuel in the state of emergency because there was a war and a very real danger. But that wasn't seen elsewhere. And I think this is the things that we try to grapple with and we're speaking with in the United Nations. When you see and you question the vote in the General Assembly as to why it's a no-brainer to get behind Ukraine, and you see some abstain, in fact, many abstain, not go against it. They would like to vote for, but they're not in a world that they have that luxury to even do so, even if they wanted, because the constraints to how the supply chains work, how finance works, the partnerships they have, will they get grain, will they not get grain, the things behind the scenes that countries are just held up to, where they lose their voice on the table.
So this is really sort of eye-opening in terms of capturing some of the challenges that have come out of this, the development goals due to sort of global politics or current events and whatnot. If I can ask you a difficult question, which is not fair, but if we were going to take the counterfactual, if we were in a world where there was no COVID and there was no war in Ukraine, what would you say would have been sort of the immediate accomplishments of the development goals?
I think that they brought us around a framework that everyone doesn't argue about. I mean, even today in the midst, whether it's a COVID response or the war in Ukraine, it is still the framework that you can come around a table with and no one argues. Everyone agrees that it is relevant, it is the best response. I mean, we have a little tension. We were in the World Bank last week at the meetings in Washington. They have two goals, and I often think that they were just trying to be cheapskates because they chose poverty and prosperity.
Does that cover all 17 of the development?
Of course it doesn't. It's missing your environment strand. I mean, where is the environment there? Where is the climate? Where is everything that has to do with sustainability? But the good news is that by the time they came to look at their evolution roadmap, which is their effort to try to reform, then they put back into the language sustainable development and resilience. So they know they've got to deal with three strands now, right. And that's helpful. So I do think that economies were changing and evolving, and we are better off than we've ever been. We have the wherewithal. We have got trillions, 400 odd trillion in savings in this world. So I mean, the resources are there. We just bailed out a bank, 400 billion down the road. So you can't say there are no resources. It's the wherewithal, the political will, the power struggles that we have, as we would say in gender, but also in the geopolitical conversations that we are having now, are the tensions, right? It is a power struggle. You are seeing that you're finding that in the East we are becoming more powerful, and so that's distorting a lot of what is happening in the world. And there's a fear of where next, and who are your alliances? Where are you going to make those alliances? Who are they going to be with? And what kind of a world are we looking at? Because there are very different ways of doing things, and I think that's a conversation we tend not to have. We're incredibly protective of the status quo, instead of opening it up to recognize that we're never not going to be an integrated global system anymore. It's whether you decide to do it for good or not. That's not going to happen. But you do see that the tensions are that not discussing them, not having these discussions as to how perhaps power not shared equally, but perhaps you let off some of it to release those tensions, not happening. And when that doesn't happen, then you find these power blocks that risk what we have gained over the 75 years, which is a much more joined up world than we've had ever.
So on this point of multilateralism and how the United Nations engages other international organizations like the World Bank, it seems like, at least on the surface, there's a lot of room for convergence, but not so probably. Would you
Well, look,
elaborate?
in 1945, it was a different world.
Right.
So it was not designed for today.
Right.
The systems we have today do not work for today. They are not just, they are not representative, and they don't respond to the needs. They just don't. So you need to throw them up in the air, and this is what we do when we say we need to look at the international financial architecture. We need a new peace deal because the peace missions that we have now are attacked, and so we're not keeping any peace, quite frankly. So we need to change that. But are you willing to look at the design that was made for a few, to recognize there are many more, and change the status quo?
Right.
And that's where we have the tensions. So if you look at the evolution roadmap for the bank, it's really tinkering. There is no ambition there. It's not framed around the SDGs or sustainable development. If you want, don't take the 17 goals out if you like, but sustainable development. Is it looking at quotas and the way state shareholders are represented that are more equal? No, it worries about if we have a capital increase here, who gets more? Do we give more to that side that we don't need to have more? It's unequal in its approach. And I'm often saying to them that you need to wake up today and think, in the environment we find ourselves, what would you design today? You can't tweak what you've got. It's not going to work. It's as simple as that. It's not fit for purpose. The financial system is not moral. It's just completely bankrupt in terms of moral bankruptcy. So you have to change things. You have to do things. This is a difficult conversation to have in the United Nations, where people have a sense of entitlement. That for very many years, it's been what they know will be how we frame things. We all love democracy. The values, the principles of democracy, and I think they still hold today as they ever were when they were invented. But does the model hold? I can speak about my country, Nigeria. It's expensive, it's short-term, and it's corrupt. And that's not going to help the 217 million Nigerians that we have. So we have to think about a different governance system. Yes, the executive and the executive, the parliament and the judiciary, but maybe the way we elect our representatives doesn't work for us. Mm-hmm. And we have to find a different way of representing their rights, their aspirations, and delivering on them. And those are discussions that, quite frankly, we need to have now, because the world is changing. The cohort is younger. Technology is going to do things that we've never imagined. In fact, it's already started. So it's a different world, and we need different responses and systems and structures and platforms for that. And are we ready to rebirth? Yeah. Question to you, because most of you in this room are going to carry that gauntlet.
So on that point, probably one of the people will say, one of the most difficult things is to sort of think about change and changing the status quo. And changing the status quo when there is inherent inequities in an organization and the change makers are the ones who have less of the power. Is that a fair characterization? And then what options are there within the organization?
I mean, for the very smallest of organizations, we try to do this with development. Yes, the system likes the status quo. It's comfortable, it's familiar, and it doesn't appear to be shaking anything up. We need to do a lot harder work. The minute we said sustainable development, we knew we were going to be lifting something much heavier. We knew we were going to be changing the status quo as far as power was concerned. So I think, people are not able to respond to that right now. The Secretary General often says, where there is power, there's no leadership, and where there's leadership, there's no power. And we have to find ways of bringing that together. And I believe that, institutions today, 75 years old, the shelf life has expired. So we don't have bureaucracies or institutions that can help us. And I think that that's why we need the leadership that might not have power, but could have maybe persuasive power, and incentivize that change that needs to happen, the thinking that needs to happen, because that you can be more, you should be more aware of the implications of not doing it. And I think that's where we're at right now, is even with the debt crisis, I have to say to you that those that have the wherewithal to do something about the debt crisis, because it's not going to affect them, are still staving off that day. And this is where you need to have conversations to say, what is it that will wake you up to a reaction, a response that you need to have, because billions of people are going to suffer. It's as though they don't see the people behind the number, and it can wait for another day. So I think we struggle with that right now.
So before we move on to Afghanistan, I have just one follow-up question. If somebody said to you, you have the opportunity to revise the development Millennium Goals right now, because after, 8 years of introspection, you might want to sort of modify them, what would be like the top modification that you would make, looking back?
I wouldn't make any changes to the Sustainable Development Goals.
That's it.
I just wouldn't do it. It's the time that we had that everyone came into the room and helped to design them as a response that the world needed. I might change some leadership around the world if I was allowed. But, I'm not.
We won't probe that further.
No.
So you recently came back from a trip to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And we know that in Afghanistan right now, there's a political crisis, a social crisis, economic crisis, humanitarian crisis. We're all very much concerned about the status of women and young girls, but we're also concerned about the status of human rights more generally. What are some of the key observations that you bring back from that trip? And what role can the United Nations play?
Well, I was with Adela in Afghanistan in 2019. And even when we went there then, we were still talking about striving for women's rights and access to everything. But there was always hope, because the structures there enabled that. And there are many countries in this world that are not perfect, but there was hope. There were negotiations that were going on. There were provinces that you could go to, you could see progress, and there were others that were looking to them. And so there was hope for women, there was hope for girls. In fact, there was hope for young people and the people of Afghanistan. And then when we returned back to the de facto authorities that we have in place, I think that, everyone was, so what does this mean? Because, the Taliban just walked in. They didn't fight their way in. There were a couple of fights on the outside before they came in a couple of provinces, but they walked into Kabul and everyone else flew out. And I think that this is really important to understand. And so our visit to Afghanistan was first the consultations as to, so now that we have a de facto authority in place is running this country, what is the international community prepared to do to bring, if it is at all possible, the Taliban back into the fold? And what is the role of the neighborhood? Because what you first saw was a neighborhood that was disconnected from the international community. So the international community talked about rights, but the neighborhood spoke about the risk of Afghanistan imploding and the effect it would have on the neighborhood. And so they very quickly came into a relationship of economy and a relationship of security. And I think that was necessary. But we could have done both, to talk about the economy and rights and security, if we could come together as a global community. And we did have an idea that, the Taliban would be held to the standards that we have for all who are members of the United Nations, so there would be some pathway to recognition based on principles, right, and the principles of our charter, the principles of which we're all part of that family. So we toyed with going to Afghanistan for over a year. There's never the right moment, right? We have to wait till this is right and the other is right. And in the end, the ban came, and it was like, how many more bans do we have to wait for before we go? And then the international community was reacting in a way that they were going to stop all flows of funding to Afghanistan, which would have been a double trouble, right? Because it wouldn't affect the Taliban. It would affect women. It would affect women and girls and huge communities, millions of people, over 40 million people. So we decided to go, and we did a lot of consultation before getting there. I think my most helpful and constructive conversations were with women from Afghanistan. There were women in the United States. There were women who were either in Turkey or in Qatar and Pakistan. And then there were women in Afghanistan, either in Kabul or as we went to Kandahar and Herat. And you know, every one of them said to me, we just don't want your voice. We want you to amplify ours. That's how you can help us. And what was clear to me was that if we're going in there for women, then we have to grapple with whatever solution we need to find on the rights agenda, on the political agenda, and come out with something that we can make tangible. So going in, we knew we had a mission. Going in, we were not very sure whether the Taliban would meet us. I mean, this is a woman-headed delegation.
You did meet with them, right?
Yes, I did. And so as a Muslim woman going in there, I mean, I was very aware. I mean, many of the Taliban, when you speak to them, they sound like some of the northern Nigerian imams and men that we have when we had Boko Haram and the terrorism that was bred in northeast of the country that I come from. So I could hear the conservatism. I could hear where they were coming from. But it was for us to go in there and say that, you know, you need to reverse these bans that you've put because these are rights denied, and they are the rights that you are determining for women in Islam don't exist. What you've got is an aberration of you know, those rights. We have a right to education. We have a right to work. You know, the jihad in Islam was funded by a woman who worked as the Prophet's wife. And so, you know, I don't know where you're getting all this from. We need to have those discussions. It was hard to have those discussions. There were many of the de facto authorities you could see were willing to engage, but they are a collective and they don't break the ranks, no matter what happens. They don't break the ranks.
Right.
And then you would speak with some who were incredibly hardline. And those conversations, you just have to bite your tongue because you didn't want to be the activist that you were, because you knew that in the end, what you're trying to do there is to act for changes to be made in the lives of women and girls. My experience is that we have to continue to engage. Yeah. We need the international community to come together, as I said, with the neighborhood and put pressure. Muslim communities and countries, the OIC, have to put that pressure. They have to continuously visit. We've seen some workarounds where we've protected some spaces. It's not enough.
Why do you think more countries, like in the OIC and elsewhere, haven't put more pressure or expressed their concerns about what's going on in Afghanistan?
Well, they have. I mean, I walked in there. It's because of them I was able, I think, to meet the Taliban. I mean, they all talk to each other. Mm-hmm. But you have to look at the rights of women in many Muslim countries. Mm-hmm. It's not all there, right? Mm-hmm. So how much of it do you have to look in the mirror and think, well, if I say this and I am right about what I say, then I need to look internally as well. And some are only just going through the changes. So Saudi Arabia, that is making all the changes it is making, it's only recent. And they've, you know, found it difficult to speak because once they do, then the pressure is on you, you know, to live up to.
You can't lecture what you're not practicing.
You cannot practice what you're not preaching. You shouldn't be able to. I mean, many do. And so, you know, we went in there, first of all, to make sure that the women of Afghanistan were not forgotten. And that whatever we put on the political agenda and the rights agenda, that we had to reinforce it. And there are many competing demands in this world. So therefore, it's easy for this to be forgotten. And Ukraine up front and center, but many other conflicts as well. So we were clear that go in there and try to regain rights, but you know, to continue to keep the pressure there, but also to find that the political pathway needed to be put back on track. And I think what we've succeeded in doing today is that we will have a conference that will be hosted by Saudi Arabia, and it will be convened by the OIC. It will be women in Islam, in Islamic countries. And so it's gone beyond Afghanistan. It is Afghanistan that has opened up that we need to look at Iran, we need to look at Yemen, we need to look at Northeast Nigeria. This is a bigger issue than just Afghanistan. And in the region, that will now open up many more questions to other women's rights in there. I'm all for, I'd like to have a discussion on the Abrahamic religions, because I think all religions in one way or another have had some oppression with women's rights, and we can see that from some evangelical movements on women's rights, sexual and reproductive health. So that's one part of it, and that conference is going to be really important because we will have Muslim women clerics. We will have a discussion that we hope coming out of it will put more pressure. It's not one convened with the UN, and I suspect that, that's for good reason, that you need maybe to have people at the table that wouldn't otherwise be. You have people dropping off if everyone was there from the Muslim world. The second is the political pathway, and what we've said is that we have some amazing envoys that work on Afghanistan, and we have Afghan women too. And what we are hoping is that we will gather them now in another 2 weeks in the region, and they will have that first meeting of envoys across the board, the region and internationally, with the Secretary General for the first time. And out of that, we hope that we will find those baby steps to put us back on the pathway to recognition. Is it possible? Don't know.
Recognition of?
Of the Taliban, a principled recognition. In other words, there are conditions. I mean,
Quid pro quo?
Let's see what that does, because that discussion has to happen. I mean, there are some that believe this can never happen. There are others that say, well, it has to happen.
Does the Taliban want the recognition?
Yes, the Taliban clearly want recognition. And that's the leverage we have.
So then, just pivoting a little bit to my last question before we open it up, and I appreciate that we have time. The situation in Sudan sort of just came out of nowhere last few days. Can you tell us what it's like for you to be at the UN in your position and trying to figure out what to do now with the situation in Sudan?
Well, I think first things first, it didn't come out of nowhere. This is the problem with multilateralism and negotiating a peace process, is that we just don't do it quickly enough. And we think that the people on the ground are there to wait until we get it right. And they're not. That's exactly what happened in Afghanistan. I think if we had acted a little bit quicker, maybe we wouldn't have had the latest bans, because we would have engaged and we would have, forestalled that. And so in Sudan, since the Prime Minister had left and we were trying to get the sides to get back on a track to speaking to the political process, we haven't had that, and we allowed many warning signs to pass, and for people in a country that is not together in all parts to find those fractures again, and then the space. So, you wake up at the weekend and you have this tragedy in Sudan, and right now we've lost our staff, but there are many more that have died. The count is rising. It is not, it's not as though you're seeing one faction on the outside fighting to get in. Now they're in, and it's a neighborhood battle. And so civilians are going to be the first casualties, women, children. And you just wonder, in the month of Ramadan in Sudan, what are we doing? And now we still look for the players that would try to bring the ceasefire, because that's the most important. It's the same thing that we say for Ukraine. We've just got to stop the war, stop the conflict. And so a cessation of the conflict is what we want right now. The UN, the African Union, IGAD, that brings together the countries of the region, the sub-region, and the League of Arab States are all involved in trying to get the two parties to step back. Right now, they both think they can win. And I think it's worth saying this, not because we're women for women's sake, but if you had women in these processes that had these discussions for peace, men tend to want to win a war. This is what we're seeing in Sudan right now. Men want to win a war. Women want to make peace. And if both come together, then we will do that. We will stop the war and we will find peace. And this is not happening in Ukraine. It's not happening, in Yemen we've got a ceasefire right now, but it's certainly not happening in Sudan as we sit here and speak today. So I hope that we can bring much more of that leadership into many of these issues that we face every day. It's we have.
Great. And would you say the initiative on Afghanistan, bringing the envoys together to come out with some outcomes and recommendations, is this part of the multilateral sort of framework that you hope that could become a new model for peace missions?
You would never have that gathering if not for the United Nations, because what we've seen now is that the more you have problems that you don't find a place, you go off and have your discussion here, eventually you come back to the UN, because you need the space where you have more people in the room than the tension between the 2 or 3 parties. And this is essential. So I think that, Afghanistan will find a solution. 3 things are going, or 4 things are going now. We're not forgetting the issues of the rights of women, and we're bringing people in to continue to discuss that and fight that good fight. But we're also bringing in the envoys for the political solution. And you're looking to the Security Council, but it is beyond the Security Council right now. What we want to do is to find things that can happen in the Security Council with an outcome. You have an assessment of the mission, and it's important that we have the mission there right now because it's the only interface and engagement that we have. And it's not just with the de facto authorities, it's also with people who are still in the country. Former President Karzai is there, still having those engagements and talking to people on the outside and on the inside. Prime Minister Abdullah, yes, who we also met. So there are many parties to this, and you have to have a framing around and a space where you can speak, and that's the multilateral space that we try to make good.
Excellent, excellent. And with that, we would like to open it up for questions from our audience. We typically give priority to our students. Over here, I think we have a microphone. Yeah. Please introduce yourself.
And you can ask anything.
My name is Nolan, and I'm a sophomore at the university. Thank you so much, Deputy Secretary General, for speaking with us today at Princeton. My question is, so you addressed earlier the tension between having many goals and having few, between the 17 Sustainable Development Goals versus the World Bank, for example, which just has the twin goals of eliminating extreme poverty and enabling prosperity. But I think the Afghanistan example shows where, having many goals can create tensions between them, because one could argue that in tackling, say, poverty and hunger in Afghanistan, we're enabling a regime that denies gender equality, which is another of the Sustainable Development Goals. So is this a weakness of the Sustainable Development Goal framework, that, it's good to be totalizing, it's good to have 17 goals that are wide in scope, but it creates challenges when the UN might have to make choices between which ones we're going to address in a given scenario? Thank you.
We will continue to say that you have to address all of them. The idea that you want to go goal by goal is a mistake to begin with. You can tackle, let me give you an example in Afghanistan, when they are looking at getting rid of the drug production in the country. What they're looking at is an alternative crop. And that alternative crop, the full production and value proposition for it should have outcomes in the lives of women. So, I don't need a gender program for that. I need to make sure that when I design these programs, that I'm designing with women in perspective at the core of it. So I think it's the way you understand how to apply the goals as a guide to the investments you need to make and the outcomes. So in some cases, you may have an investment opportunity, as with climate action, and maybe another goal that is on energy transitions. But the outcomes that you would have would tackle other goals. And I think that's the way you need to see it. So I still believe that it is, expressive of how we deal with the socioeconomic and the environmental aspects of an economy, of a nation, and of society. It's never, we just had a gender review in the United Nations 27 years later. Why have we not met the Beijing promises? And the findings of that gender review, in a way, were a little shocking. This many years later, that the institution itself was grappling with the definitions of gender equality. So, sometimes in an institution or in academia, you're going over the process so much that you lose sight of the goal and what you need to do to achieve it. And I think this is what had happened. We've got UN Women, so they're going to deal with gender equality. Really? No. Each one of the 42 agencies that I have under my oversight for development all need to be telling me, in the investments they've made, what's happened to 50% of the population? How has that impacted? It's the same with youth. How do you make a project out of youth? They should gain from every investment that we have. They're an inclusive part of our economy and our society.
Hello, hi. My name is Max Diallo Jacobson, and I'm the president of the Princeton African Students Association. And it is an honor to have you here. And I hope that SPIA will continue to bring more African diplomats, dignitaries, and politicians to campus. I wanted to direct a question specifically to the African Union. In December of last year, you spoke about how the UN is committed to nurturing that partnership with the AU. And I was wondering if since then and moving forward, what do you think are the main challenges for the African Union and the main opportunities for it? And in particular, for us African students and the future African youth, what do we see as like an opportunities for us to get involved in the AU and bolstering that organization?
Mm-hmm. First things first, you all have this privilege to be in really good academic institutions, many people learning where others haven't. But the institutions we need to go fix and to make work for the people are really hard. And when we started with President Kagame to look at the reform of the African Union, one of the things we said was that we wanted to make this an institution where young people in diaspora, Africans in diaspora, wherever they were around the world, would want to come and work for the African Union before they would go to the World Bank or to the UN. And that still hasn't happened because it's a really difficult business to retrofit a bureaucracy that has cast in concrete in some manners. And it's the same for many institutions like that. But what the reform has done has looked at ensuring that some of those representations that we have in the AU can work for the institutions we created. So how member states can become more engaged in NEPAD, more engaged in the humanitarian agency that we're just about to put out there, more engaged in, you saw the success of our CDC. And the success of the CDC was a new way of doing business in the African Union with partnerships. So I think that the African Union, as with the UN, needs to open up the space in the membership to bring in other partnerships from academia, because we really do need a lot of foresight analysis, we need a lot of research, we need technology. It's not going to come from the bureaucracy that can't really pay for itself right now. And I think that with the UN, we recognize two bureaucracies came together, each doing their mandate, but no one really working together. We were not finding the solutions together. There was more of a prescription on one side and then an obvious rejection of that prescription and something else. And in 2 weeks, I go to the African Union just because of that, to sit with the commissioners there and say, okay, now the UN is going to get behind your priorities, bring our expertise, and try to make that work for the priorities of the African Union. And hopefully those priorities too are the priorities of countries, priorities of regions. Not always the case. So in short, it's a messy business, but you have to engage it, because if you just leave it, what happens is it goes to the lowest common denominator and mediocrity, and that is even worse, because then the enabling environment is not made conducive because there's no capacity to even get there. So people like myself, we've always had an option to go off and be in the diaspora and work right from when we came out of school. But we chose to be part of nation building, which is hard, because you're dealing with institutions that have got a lot of baggage, and you're trying to change them from the inside out, and it's going to take generations in some cases. So I would say that we need you in the systems. And we do need you in the politics. And if we don't have young people from all over in that, making that change, then it will be very difficult for it to happen. Changes I made going into a Ministry of Environment, when I was given the Ministry of Environment in my country we are 36 states that make up this federation. My state thought that they had been dealt a mean blow by just getting environment. So that's how low they thought of environment. And they thought that I would just be the dustbin lady. This was not good politically for the state. But what we went in there was with a group of young people who understood, who were well educated, Nigerians, and we changed. We made the connection with environment and climate change and the conflict in the Niger Delta, and the pollution, and in the northeast and the drying up of the Lake Chad. We made it interesting. We incentivized people. We got the first domestic green bond in all of Africa. Just because, and I have to tell you, finance in my country, Ministry of Finance didn't know what I was doing. And they were asking, why is environment in the stock exchange? Well, because in the stock exchange, they were ready to work with me to get that bond done. But then difficulty, the policy, the regulatory environment, Ministry of Finance didn't even know what we were doing. And then they had to learn. So there are exciting things that you can do. And I think what you have to do is engage with people who you find have got some good leadership and can make a difference from the inside out. And it's hard. And in the African Union right now, in some of those institutions, NEPAD, amazing woman that's in charge of that. CDC, a great guy there. The AFCT, which is our free trade piece. So that there's pieces you can make good of. They're not ready-made for you to walk in and think everything's a 9 to 5. It's going to be 24/7, messy, frustrating, and I don't know from I'm from Nigeria, so many Nigerians who are in diaspora. When we had them back in Nigeria, they'd say "you people," and then I'd be looking at them and saying "which people?" "We people." So sometimes you get frustrated because you've been trained outside. You've been you're coming back to do the right thing, and then you suddenly find you're back in a country, your hands are tied. I think this is what, Adela, you would have found when you were in Afghanistan, is that it's not straightforward. It's quite complex, but it's doable, and you just have to, go for it.
Other questions?
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. My name is Anika Astana, and I was recently at the Commission on the Status of Women, in March, where I think one of the parts of that conference emphasized youth engagement and how this was the first sort of attempt that the CSW had at making sure that youth had equal access and opportunity and having a voice in terms of what was being discussed and being part of the dialogue in terms of how to shape and how to continue reviewing policies and actions. And so I would just love to know some of your thoughts on youth engagement within the United Nations and how you've sort of mentioned in your talk today the immense power that comes from bringing in young people and young talent. And I would love to know a little bit more about your thoughts on that, how you've sort of felt that you fostered that during your career and what more there could be to be done.
Can you imagine, we did not have an office for youth in the 75 years of our existence until this year. And when the Secretary General came in and said, we've got to have more young people in, what did that mean? In the Secretariat, for which we have remit over, because sometimes you're the Secretary, not the General, we suddenly found the average age of people coming into the Secretariat was 40. And so what were we talking about? How could we get more young people in there? And then when young people came in, there was a frustration because the bureaucracy limited your aspirations to get up and do. And this is because we're a complicated family of 193 countries, and each country is at a different space, and the way they treat young people is the way they see that discussion that they come to at the table. So you'll find some parts of the world who will discuss young people with an enormous opening. Yes, let's open the whole UN to young people. And other people say, no, not yet. They're not ready. They don't know what they're doing. They haven't reached their age yet. And then you'll never reach your age if you listen to some of those countries. You'll be sort of 67 and they'll say you're youth. The resolution that brought about the youth office with the efforts that the youth envoy made were amazing. So now we have a space that we can engage with every facet of the UN and bring young people in and young people's voices. Representation is a big thing. We have to get representation of youth in the 193 countries and not just through the youth office and a few young people coming in. So representation is a very big issue. Women and young people, and young people include women, have to be in the delegations, have to be in the missions. And quite frankly, it's every country. I sat to meet with the OECD DAC today, and we were talking about ODA, and in front of me were 6 men. And this is not representative of anything that, in fact, they will insist countries do for gender. And so never mind youth. I won't tell you what age they were. So we have to push that. I think a lot of this will come from the country level as well. It's really important that you are defining your future now. And that's not always the case. So in the consultations, in the framing of the solutions to many things, I do think that you're going to find a way to lead pretty soon, because technology will do it. Already your voices are stronger because of technology. We're hearing things we never heard before. We're seeing disruptions we never saw before, and we don't know how to handle them. And it's only going to be young people that are going to be able to do that. So I think there's a space to walk through that door. Very difficult with the Commission on this, for the Status of Women, the CSW. That's also a space that you're not all there. And even if you are, we tend to fragment ourselves with the, am I a feminist? And if I am, which kind of a feminist am I? And, we have got women's movements and feminists, and gender was in a space in Beijing where we came at it that it was binary. Today we talk about non-binary gender, so gender identity. All these things are coming in your time. And many of us have challenges in trying to understand. And so it needs you to come in, because you will frame that. You will not have our baggage. And that's what I hope that you can introduce. And we have to be responsible enough not to give it to you. There's a lot of it.
Awesome. So I'm mindful of the fact that, how are we on time? We hit the time. So I want to apologize. Can we, maybe we can take just two questions here. Nahid, and I have one wrap-up question, and we'll end. We started a little bit late, but I know that we're not going to hold you back from dinner.
I promise I'll be very short.
I have like 38 minutes before I break fast, so
we will get you there.
just make sure I'm there. I've been looking at the gentleman up there with a Coke, but I can see you.
Your Excellency, thank you so much for your wonderful remarks. Thank you, Ambassador Ross, for facilitating this event. And we are very grateful for your moderation, Dean Amani. I want to be very specific about Afghanistan. And you talked in a very well way about the multilateralism and how it can facilitate the nations that are in need of that. And in the last 18 months, unfortunately, OIC and so many other platforms failed to help the people of Afghanistan, women of Afghanistan. You traveled to Afghanistan. You know how hard the situation for women. I want to quote Your Excellency. You talked in your statement that women of Afghanistan are living centuries ago, centuries behind the modern time that we are living right now. And Afghanistan remained the only country in the planet that women and girls deny the basic rights of a human being. So don't you think, what concerns me and women of Afghanistan is that even if Taliban have the recognition, the crisis will continue. And that's because, not just because women's rights and human rights matter, not just because of that. I think beyond that, because with Taliban takeover, this global jihadism got a theological legitimacy. So many other terrorist groups in Nigeria and Central Asia, in South Asia, in Middle East, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Hizb ut-Tahrir, Lashkar e-Tayyiba, they're all seeking territories because they say that as Taliban could defeat the United States, why not us? And this is really an alarming pattern for backsliding democracies. And I think for democracy and also security of the world, and also with the rise of authoritarian regimes, that is alarming for all of us that are bounded in our equitable push for a better tomorrow. And what do you think? What's your perspective? It matters to us because we are, as Afghanistan Policy Lab, we want to use your perspective in our policy works. And we believe that as a woman, as a Muslim woman, the future of the world really is through the leadership of United Nations as well, as a platform that can bring change to the situation. Thank you.
The Taliban are very clear about what they want. They have been since the 90s. And they've come back, and maybe we don't see the very darkest of their sides yet. And multilateralism, because it is so exhausted, I mean, it is in another place right now, and it's not there for you, you're right. But the Taliban say it. There are many countries don't say it, but they do it. And that's why when you ask me the question as to why it is we don't have the neighborhood engaging, it's because they don't say it, but they're as bad as. Because women's rights aren't respected. We saw that recently in Iran. We've seen that in Yemen. We see that in my country. It's even in the countries you think are so free, it's a limited freedom. And it's because they don't come out and say, we're not giving you freedom, but they don't give you freedom. The Taliban say it, others don't. And I think that this is really important for us to grapple with as we come to discussing Afghanistan, because it is the opening to many, many other issues. And the Taliban, they succeed because the nation itself is conservative. The first time that Adela took me to Kabul and I met with people who had come from Kandahar as internally displaced people. No. This is why they succeed, because you have a conservative society. Now that society must be allowed to travel. We have to move them. And I know many NGOs in Afghanistan where the Muslim clerics, women, were able to train men clerics and bring them from the dark ages into where we are. It's the same thing that we did with Boko Haram. I mean, Boko Haram, quite frankly, was just kicking against the injustice of the state at that time, a particular state. But it grew roots in religion. So I think that from our perspective, we have to go back to the root causes, and we have to go back to insisting on engaging over the long term. It's not a quick fix for any of this. And I think we do have to use the international community to leverage that, and to have those conversations and those convenings. So when these our envoys come to meet together, the people of the region have got to speak. In the rooms that I've been, the people of the region don't speak, and the international community speak. So it's just one-way traffic. And what we need to do is to have that speak. I hope that you will see in the conference of the OIC something completely different, because we are pushing for that conversation to be a meeting that is designed by women. And the men can come, but it's going to be designed by women. And we have to engage that. And I do say that allow people to travel, because if you force conservatism to turn on a sixpence overnight, it won't happen. You will still go back. And I think that this is what we don't do. We don't have that, the traveling of people from a very conservative space to where we need them to be. And I think I saw some movement in Afghanistan before they came back. Maybe to tell you today that, we have, coming out of Kandahar is a request for training on gender policy. I mean, this is just like, really? Okay, so do I become hopeful, or do I remain a cynic? And I think that one of the things that perhaps will kill all spirit of everything is cynicism. And there's sometimes good reason to be cynical, but it shouldn't be a luxury that we think we have. We have to take whatever we can and we have to run with it. If they say to me that's what they want to do, okay, fine, I'm going to provide it. And hopefully that will happen. But we have no engagement with Afghanistan right now. If the Taliban tell me, I have enacted 3 laws, I now have a law against gender-based violence, I have a law that has brought back inheritance. You and I know that Muslim inheritance, women have more rights than most people in Western countries. And they have another one that stopped the blood money for women. I don't have any, and I can see the law, but I don't have any engagement that the international community will allow me to have to know whether in fact they're implementing it or not. And that's what we need. We need to have an engagement to say, no, you said you're doing this, but you're not. They will tell me there was no corruption in Afghanistan. By and large, they're right, because, what should the implications for being corrupt is rather harsh, right? There's no rule of law per se. So maybe they collect taxes. Yes, they do. I mean, that's how they're living informally. But there's nothing to engage them, nothing to say, no, you're not. We do it on the basis of the perceptions that we have or knowledge that we have on the inside. And we have to take them to task, because we cannot allow that they continue to get worse, which is what happens when you don't engage. They become stronger in the environment. Why? Because the neighborhood are engaging with them economically. There are trade surpluses with Afghanistan today. There is banking system that is put in place for Afghanistan today, and we still say there are sanctions. So we either engage and we pull them to the right side, or we don't, and we see where it drifts. And I'm of the school that we must engage. We must dine with the devil with a long spoon. That's what we have to do. Our people in the mission have been told, don't go to work. You can't work for the UN anymore as a national. The first thing I will say is that please treat the Taliban like COVID. We don't know what they're going to do or how they're going to react. So please keep our women safe at home. They can work from home. They can earn a salary from home. And when we are negotiating that space back again, and we have the vaccination, then we'll let them out. But I know that 3, 4 are picked up, and maybe I won't see them again. I am not going to risk any one Afghan woman to people we know are unpredictable. So it's not easy, but we continue to convene around these issues. The most important thing is that we continue to convene. Let's not convene on Afghanistan, which is what happened until the last ban came. No one was talking about Afghanistan until the last ban in November. It was, we moved to another crisis, and the crises are many in the world. So we don't have the attention span. We're in Sudan today, and I'm surely there will be something else in DRC or Mali, and there will be something. And we need to make sure that space is there to convene. I will say one thing: if you have a voice, use it to tell member states that they need to be in that town hall. Because the tendency now is to go off and find these smaller town halls that are comfortable and that you can continue not to solve the problems. We have to have fire under our feet, and we have to be in the UN and accountable because you're represented there. So you need to ask your representatives in the UN, what are you doing not in the UN trying to solve these problems? And we, the SG and myself and the management of the Secretariat try to make those spaces available. We are negotiating the financing for development today, a resolution for the means of implementation for the SDGs. Why is silence broken and we may not get an agreement? Because of the geopolitical tensions. The group there that now have brought up the sanctions issue has never happened before in a finance discussion. But they are telling you that these coercive measures impact their economies. And so they must have it there and it must be resolved. But the other part of the world will tell you no, because those sanctions are there for a good reason. These are with regimes that are pressing their people. So yes, not a good place, but let me just say to you, the world it is and the aspirations we have for the world, valid in that space. Let's keep working at closing the gap. It is worth it. It is necessary. If we don't do it, I don't know who else will. And that's our commitment every day is to come to work to try to do that.
Thank you so much for those wonderful, wonderful insights. As you know, here at the school, we're committed to training the next generation of policy leaders, and there's only so much we can teach in our classrooms. So bringing you here to give us fresh perspectives on what's going on with success, failures, challenges, ongoing dilemmas, different ways to think about things, especially as they pertain to Afghanistan, has been very, very eye-opening, impactful, and we really are thankful and grateful from the bottom of our hearts. Really great honor to have you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.